Part 2. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn. I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 11. 100,000 troops camped on the south side of Hike Mountain. Less than 100 miles behind was Yanliang Pass. The army led by Shenzhongan was like a shield, cutting across the middle of the Zihu people and the people in the pass. Shen Yu followed the team, and a group of people walked to the temporary military training ground and stood in a wide place. Shen Yu is tall and stands out among women, but she is not so conspicuous in front of a group of men in the military camp. The person in front of her was half a head taller than her. He looked back at her, and then turned back again after a while. Shen Yu touched her face. When she sneaked in, she had darkened her face and thickened her eyebrows to make herself look rougher. The person in front turned around for the third time. Shen Yu's hand hanging by her side had already made a move. If he called out to Shen Yu in front of everyone here, she would be exposed. As long as the man made a move or spoke, she could only take him first. Knocked out. The man frowned and looked at him for a long time, then pointed his index finger at her. Your name, are you that mountain gunner? Shen Yu. You are a mountain gunner, your whole family is a mountain gunner. But he smiled and said, yes, it's me. Were you assigned to our place? Shen Yu nodded. Why are you standing here? Come forward. The man pulled her and pushed her forward, standing where Shen Yu had just been. There were a lot of people coming and going in the military camp. People died in battle every year, conscription was going on every year, the troops were reorganized after every battle, and the casualties were replenished. Some people just met and disappeared the next day, so it is common for them to be unable to remember people. They had just had a confrontation with the Zihu people 2 days ago, resulting in thousands of casualties. The Zihu army's casualties were even more serious. Shenzhongan ordered a pursuit of 10 miles and then camped on the same spot. No matter how bloody a man is, his fighting spirit will be high after this battle. The school grounds roared loudly, and the soldiers lined up to count the number of people. When Yang Bang was called, the man behind him shouted, "Here we are." The sound was so deafening that it almost pierced Shen Yu's eardrums. She rubbed her ears and saw a man riding a tall horse. The horse's hooves were pacing among the various formations. Immediately, Shen Zhao's sharp gaze slowly swept across the army. Shen Zhao was blurry from this distance. Shen Yu subconsciously lowered her head to hide even though she knew he couldn't see her. If Shen Zhao caught her, she would definitely be tied up and sent back to Shenjing. Shen Zhao was seen stopping on the high platform, turning his head and saying something to the deputy general beside him. The deputy general nodded, and then Shen Zhao rode off the high platform. Shen Yu's eyes were following Shen Zhao, and she didn't even notice that the queue had moved. The man behind her pushed her and whispered, "Hurry up, move." He muttered again, "Why are you so thin? You will fall over if the wind blows. Why do you want to join the army?" Shen Yu followed the queue and replied to him absent-mindedly, "There is no food at home. If I don't join the army, I will starve to death." Yang Bang said, "That's about the same as me. All my family members are dead and I'm the only one left. I think it's better to go to the battlefield and kill a few Zihu people, and I have to drag a few Zihu barbarians on my back." In the time it took for her to speak, Shen Yu lost her sight and disappeared from sight of Shen Zhao. Shen Zhao rode his horse all the way to the main tent, got off his horse, and entered the tent with his riding whip. The sky was blue and the sun was bright, but the lamps were still lit in the tent. Shen Zhao sat down and said, "I'm afraid it's going to snow." Shenzhongan asked, "The food and grass supplies have been late for 10 days, right?" 11 days, Shen Zhao took a sip of hot tea. This was the only old tea left in the army. It didn't taste much better, but it was refreshing. He frowned tightly. "The people in the baggage team don't know what to eat. I counted them in the morning, and there is enough food and grass left to last 2 days. It is said that before the three armies move, the grain and grass go first. As early as the departure from Shengjing, the Ministry of Household Affairs has begun to allocate grain and grass baggage. However, except for the first batch of grain and grass arriving on time, there has been no follow-up news. Shenzhongan frowned. I'm afraid something happened on the road. If the snow falls, the grain and horse road will be even more difficult to walk. Send a team of soldiers to pick it up, and then send a scout out to explore. Shen Zhao threw the riding whip aside and said, I borrowed another batch of grain from Ganzhou Prefecture. It should be delivered tomorrow, but this is the last batch. This is not a good harvest year, and they don't have much grain in their warehouses. We also need to consider plowing and planting for next year, and the borrowed grain is only enough to last us for 5 more days. Ganzhou Prefecture is located in Yanliang Pass, and it is the largest city in the vicinity. If the prefectural capital does not have much grain stocks, it will be even more difficult for ordinary families. Shenzhongan sighed, I hope the baggage team can arrive as soon as possible. Shen Zhao has been feeling uneasy these past 2 days. He said, General, we have to make second-hand preparations. If we can't get 11 Ju to retreat within 7 days and we don't have food and grass, we will be very passive. Although the two are father and son, they are still commensurate with their positions in the military camp. What do you think? Shenzhongan asked. There is not much drill today, the main thing is to count the number of people and rest the whole army. As soon as the queue dispersed, Yang Bang held Shen Yu's shoulder and walked towards the tent. There are few people in our tent. 2 more brothers were lost 2 days ago. Now there are only 7 people including you. Then he opened the curtain. There were already 4 or 5 people sitting in the tent. Fortunately, it was winter and everyone was too cold to take off their shoes. Shen Yu once entered the camp in the dog days of summer. The soldiers inside were all shirtless and barefoot. The smell was so touching that it could make people burst into tears on the spot. Yang Bang introduced them one by one. This is Yu Zy, this is Ahu, this is. After introducing them one by one, he patted Shen Yu on the shoulder again and said, this is Shan Power. Who gave you this nickname? Yu Zy asked. As his name suggests, Yu Zy has a mouth so big that it can swallow people. Shen Yu also wanted to know who Yang Bang remembered badly, so he must be remembered as a mountain cannon. Where are your things? Yang Bang asked. Shen Yu's baggage is still hidden under the tent next to the main tent. They are all daily necessities and it is not convenient to take them. Besides, she will not stay here for a long time. She will leave in 5 days when the battle in her previous life is over. I don't have anything. Ahu looked her up and down. You are so thin, can you carry a knife? Shen Yu looked at him and said, it's no problem to carry you. Yu Zy laughed when he heard it. When he smiled, his mouth became even bigger, with 32 teeth visible, and he had the potential to swallow the sky. Yang Bang pointed, stop laughing, you'll scare the newcomer. Yang Bang was an enthusiastic person and even went to help Shen Yu get a quilt and some clothes. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 12. After nightfall, snoring sounded one after another in the tent. Shen Yu couldn't sleep, thinking about what happened in her previous life over and over in her mind. In her memory, the express delivery back to Shengjing looked like this. On October 27, Shen Zhao led his troops to raid the Zihu camp and was trapped. Shenzhongan led the remaining soldiers to rescue him. However, the supervisor's persuasion failed, and Shenzhongan rushed in to pursue the trap, killing all 100,000 troops outside the pass. The military newspaper was very vague. No one knew exactly what happened on the front line, because only a few people survived out of a total of 100,000 people. She had felt something strange in her previous life. She knew her father, he had the most stable temperament, and it was really inappropriate to put the word advantage on him. However, she didn't know much about it until she entered the court. Only after marrying Zhang Lian did she find out some information from him. There might have been a mole in that battle. Those were 100,000 living soldiers, and there was always someone who had to bear the blame for that battle. Regardless of whether there were any doubts in it, Shen Zhongan became the best candidate for the sinner. Shen Yu took the initiative to take a job during the day and deliver things to people in various tents. She took the opportunity to thoroughly explore the layout of the camp. Except for the grain and grass department, which was heavily guarded, she did not detect any abnormalities in other places. Judging from the current situation alone, she could not find any clues of defeat. The current situation in Yanliang Pass made her run around like a headless fly. She would check wherever she happened to see if she could be prepared, and in the meantime she would sneak out of the camp and go to the city to meet a few people. At night, the temperature dropped sharply, and a northerly wind came again. There were knives in the wind, which made people's cheeks hurt. A horse quickly approached the camp. The scout galloped on his horse. When he approached the gate of the camp, he raised his token and said, "Urgent report." The guarding soldier checked the token and let people in. The scouts didn't even get off their horses and ran straight to the main tent. "General. Urgent report." Shen Zhongan slept restlessly, and turned over when he heard the voice, "Come in." The scout knelt down on one knee after entering the door. "General, the team that went to pick up the food was completely wiped out, and there was no trace of the baggage team." Shen Zhongan looked solemn, casually picked up the cloak and put it on his body, saying, "Let Shen Zhao come to my tent." Shen Zhao had just gotten up from bed, and the people who called him didn't dare to say anything. Only after entering the tent did he hear Shen Zhongan talk about it. Shen Zhongan said, "There are not many people in the team to receive the food. It looks like they were robbed and killed by bandits." Shen Zhao shook his head. "The team that received the food didn't bring anything. Bandits wouldn't do such a thankless job. I'm afraid someone framed them." The two looked at each other and saw danger signals in each other's eyes. Shen Zhao rubbed his face vigorously to refresh himself and said, "We must make a quick decision before the remaining food is exhausted. I'm afraid we will have to use the second plan." Shen Zhongan nodded and summoned the generals to discuss the situation overnight. In the evening, Yang Bang retreated into his tent. "This wind is blowing like a knife on my body, it would be better to just fall snow." Yu Dezhui answered, "Luoxiu, that won't work. The troops are being mobilized over there, probably to do something." Shen Yu has been paying attention to the movements of the military camp, but she has never found any signs of sending troops. Moreover, today is only the 25th, isn't that 2 days earlier than in the previous life? She grabbed Yu Dezhui and said, "What did you say? How do you know?" Yu Dezhui was startled. "Shh, don't tell anyone. I have a fellow countryman in the forward camp. I told him this when I met him before." Shen Yu didn't ask any more questions, raised the curtain and went out. Yu Dezhui shouted from behind, "Don't tell anyone." Shen Yu was quiet in the wind for a while, and was awakened by the wind. She knew that this could not continue. No matter whether things would develop according to the original route, she had to warn Shen Zhao in advance. Shen Zhao came out of the main tent and walked to his own tent. On the way, he was thinking about the layout of the battle. As he approached the tent, his eyes flickered casually. After taking 2 steps, his whole person suddenly froze and looked at him in disbelief. One direction. The sky was getting dark, and it was impossible to see anyone 5 meters away. Shen Zhao took the torch from the door and walked towards the people over there, his face getting darker as he got closer. When he walked up to the man, his face was as black as the bottom of a pot. Shen Zhao's chest rose and fell a few times. He raised his hand on the knife and tapped the person twice, "Get in here." Shen Yu lowered her head and followed Shen Zhao dejectedly into the tent. As soon as Shen Zhao entered the tent, he threw his saber on the table and turned around to look at Shen Yu. You are so brave. You are wearing a military uniform. Where did you steal it? Plucked off the body of a deserter, Shen Yu whispered. Shen Zhao strode over, wiped the black stain on her face with his sleeves, and scolded, look what you have done to yourself. Shen Yu's cheek hurt from being rubbed, so she pushed his hand away and said solemnly, brother, don't scold me in a hurry. I have more important things to say now. Shen Zhao knew her very well. Although she was a joker, she never messed around in important matters. What's up? Are you going to raid the Zihu camp tonight? Shen Zhao's eyes suddenly darkened and he stared at her for a long time before asking, where did you know that? I don't have time to explain to you now, Shen Yu said, but not tonight. Shen Zhao turned around and sat on the desk and thought for a while, then shook his head and said, time is not waiting for me. We have no time to waste time with the Zihu people. It will snow soon. Our horses are not cold resistant, and the Zihu people are in the snow. The battle is better than ours, and besides. He did not continue. Shen Yu approached, is it because the food and grass can't hold on? Shen Zhao looked up, and Shen Yu ignored the doubts in his eyes and continued, I have been in the camp for a few days, and I have been paying attention to the movements in the camp, but I haven't kept up with the baggage. Shen Zhao said seriously, except for the first batch, the rest of the grain and grass were all borrowed from Ganzhou Prefecture. There is no surplus grain in the city. Shen Yu nodded and asked, how long can the food and grass last? 2 days. Shen Yu said, there are several small cities in Ganzhou, and further south is Chengdu Mansion. We can transport grain from there. It's easy for you to say. Shen Zhao added some water to the pot on the stove in the tent. Where does the food come from? I borrowed the food from Ganzhou Prefecture with an IOU. They understand the meaning of death and coldness. They don't borrow it? No, but people in other cities may not give us face, and there are no granaries in Chengdu Prefecture, so they cannot support such a large expenditure. We don't want to borrow it from the Yamen. Shen Yu's eyes were illuminated by the firelight. Loose trading companies are all over the Zhou dynasty, and there are many rice and grain shops among them. We can ask our grandmother in Hezhu to borrow it. Shen Zhao's eyes brightened for a moment, but then dimmed quickly. He shook his head and said, it's too late. Even if we rush to Hezhu non-stop now, it will take at least 10 days. In addition, it will take at least half a month to requisition food. We simply can't last that long. 5 days, we only need to hold on for 5 more days, Shen Yu said. I asked LV Yao to set off for Hezhu 4 days ago. I am riding my Bengziao. I don't think I can reach Hezhu in 4 or 5 days. I also have arrangements for Hongqiao. She has rushed to Chengdu Mansion with my token in advance, and asked them to start preparing food. As soon as the food from Chengdu Mansion arrives, it will be enough for us to last for a few more days. Hezhu will come later. Food and grass will be available. From the moment she said that green medicine had been sent to Hezhu, a look of surprise appeared on Shen Zhao's face. How do you know this in advance? Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 14. Shen Yu's eyes lit up. My brother also discovered the problem. I'm going to burn their food. You go and cut off the road, and say hello to me when it's done. Once the beacon is lit, they will definitely return to the defense. My brother just takes the opportunity to fight back. Kong Qing was secretly frightened. The eldest lady's mind was spinning too fast. If the night wind hadn't woken her up, it would have been difficult to keep up with her rhythm. Kong Qing stood up and squatted back. How about I stay and you go and cut off the road? I think there are more than 2,000 people in Xieying. It's too dangerous. Go quickly. Shen Yu pushed him. What do grown men do? As soon as the others left, Shen Yu rested in the dark, her mind suddenly enlightened. This life will definitely not be like the previous life. 100,000 soldiers are still there, my father and brother are still there, and the people in the past can live and work in peace and contentment. Half an hour later, the whistle came from the wind again. Shen Yu moved her hands and feet, made gestures, and led the remaining 10 people towards the grain and grass warehouse. The sky was still very dark. Before the storm, the dense clouds were so low that not even a single star in the sky could be seen. Shen Zhao raised his eyes and looked out, and saw that the smoke in the Zihu camp was still rising. He was getting a little anxious while waiting, and his thumb on the handle of the knife was fiddling unconsciously. Wait another half moment, and attack directly if you can't smoke anymore. Time passes breath by breath. The scouts from the front came on horseback, the smoke is burning. Attack. 10,000 fine cavalry moved upon hearing the wind and marched towards Zihu's northern camp. There were sounds of fighting in the camp. When Shen Zhao arrived, he saw Shen Yu drawing a knife, and the blade brought out a series of blood beads. Shen Yu also saw him, slashed a Zihu soldier to death with a knife, and said, "Brother, there are only 2,000 people left in the camp. You take people to the south camp to raid their backs." There was a huge fire in the camp. Shen Zhao drew his bow and shot one to death. "I will leave 2,000 men for you." Shen Yu, 1,000. "I said 2,000, just 2,000. Shen Zhao gave the order without waiting for her to refute, leaving 2,000 men behind and led his troops away. The camp was filled with the smell of blood. Jinky counted the number of people and captured 300 Zihu soldiers. It was just dawn when Shen Zhao arrived at the south camp. He led 8,000 soldiers to outflank Zihu from the right rear side, while Shen Zhongan led his troops to press on the front. From being surrounded to being surrounded. Although Zihu suffered a lot of casualties last time, the number of Zihu troops was greater than they imagined. Even with the current outflanking formation, they still didn't have much of an upper hand, and the Zihu army didn't gain much advantage. Shen Zhongan stretched out his hand in the wind, and the wind passed through his fingers. He frowned and looked at the battlefield, and after careful consideration, he ordered, "Withdraw." The army retreated, and heavy snow fell halfway. Fortunately, they left early. The deputy general rode his horse beside Shen Zhongan and said excitedly, "It's been a long time since we fought such a good battle." 11 Ju thought we were going to raid the south camp, but when he heard that the north camp was burned, he immediately came back to help. Hey, for the first time, 11 Ju people are walking around like fools. Shen Zhongan said, "It's snowing. This battle will not be easy." The Zihu people did not suffer many casualties in this battle, and the fundamentals have not been damaged. They can attack again after reorganizing their troops. We should not take it lightly. The deputy general claimed so. Shen Zhao frowned and asked as soon as he entered the camp, "Is there another group of people back?" The soldier guarding the camp said, "No." Shen Zhao looked at the north, his brows furrowed. There are only more than 2,000 people in the Zihu North camp. Shen Yu would not have been stuck for so long, unless the horse road was not blocked. The Zihu people who went to make a surprise attack came back in time to block her there. The more Shen Zhao thought about it, the more frightened he became, and he said to the soldiers who had just returned to the camp to rest and had not dispersed yet, "Give me the order to order 30,000 troops immediately, and follow me to the Zihuabei camp." Shen Zhongan heard him shouting before he even returned to his account. He turned around quickly and asked, "What are you doing?" Shen Zhao's throat was blocked and he rode his horse over to stop next to Shen Zhongan. His face turned pale and he said, "Ah, I only brought 2,000 people to the Zhuobei camp and I haven't come back yet." "What? When did she come?" Shen Zhongan barely lifted it up in one breath, pointing the horsewhip at Shen Zhao, and was speechless for a long time. He got on his horse first, whipped the horse's buttocks, and when he ran to the gate, he stopped again. The snow was falling heavily, and in a moment the sky and the earth merged into a vast expanse of snow. Shen Zhongan stood in the snow, with his biological daughter on one side and righteousness on the other. If we send troops at this moment, we are likely to encounter the situation of being attacked from both sides by the Zhu people in the blizzard. He is not just a father, but a general who is responsible for the lives of thousands of soldiers. It is so difficult to make a choice. Send my order and the entire army rests. General, Shen Zhao lost his voice. Shen Zhongan raised his hand to stop him from continuing. He couldn't bear it, but he couldn't risk the lives of tens of thousands of people just for his own selfishness. Shen Zhao knew what he was thinking. He was silent for a moment, then suddenly raised his whip and ran out of the camp. Father can give up on Au, but he can't. He is her brother, and he has been following him around since he was a child. At that time, he was not as good as a swordsman, so he clamored to practice martial arts with his brother. Shen Zhao's eyes were red. He must save her, even if he was alone. "Stop him," Shen Zhongan shouted. The heavy gate in front was closed, and the soldiers pushed the Luzai, Zai, to block the entrance of the camp tightly. "Get out of my way, or I'll kill you too." Shen Zhao pointed at the soldiers at the door and said. Shen Zhongan said with consternation, "You are so brave, you dare to point a knife at one of your own, come on. Take off his armor." While the two parties were in a stalemate, the soldiers from Wanglishan suddenly blew a whistle and shouted, "A team is approaching." The wind and snow were raging, and flakes of snow were blown away by the wind. The view from the upstairs was blocked, and it was only when I got closer that I could see clearly that it was my own person. Shen Yu's eyes turned white, and her legs were so cold that she almost lost consciousness. The wheels made a clanging sound on the snow, and the 200-meter-long team was getting closer and closer to the camp. "It's our elite cavalry," the soldier shouted from the watchtower. "Open the door." Shen Zhao went to open the heavy gate himself without waiting for the soldiers to take action. As soon as a gap was opened, he squeezed through the middle. He ran wildly in the snow and finally saw the figure in the snow. Shen Yu was exhausted, so she approached on horseback, lowered her head and smiled at him. "Brother, I brought you something good." Shen Zhao's eyes were red. She was like this when she was a child. She would hold any good things in front of him like a treasure. Shen Zhao reached out to catch her, feeling that she was as cold as ice. He quickly untied his cloak and wrapped her in, hugging her tightly and not daring to speak. The queen was afraid that she would not come back, afraid that she would be alone in a fight to the death. Shen Yu entered the camp, followed by dozens of grain carts, pushed by Zhu prisoners of war, and escorted by fine cavalry on both sides. Shen Yu was wrapped in a large cloak and warming herself by the fire in the main tent. She was holding hot tea in her hands and felt little consciousness. The snow on her body had melted by the fire and made her look even more clammy. Shen Zhongan looked at her without saying a word. He wanted to speak several times, but he couldn't curse when he saw her pitiful appearance. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 15. Shen Zhao and Kong Qing knelt in the tent. "Get up," Shen Zhongan said to Kong Qing. Kong Qing glanced at Shen Zhao. The general was still kneeling and he did not dare to get up. Shenzhongan's lieutenant general advised, "This time, we finally had a near miss. We caught the Zihu people off guard, and they also transported most of the grain and grass back to Beijing. I think the merits and demerits are equal to each other." Shenzhongan looked at Shen Zhao and said, "Speak for yourself." Shen Yu took the lead and said, "I came here myself, and it was my idea to go to Beijing." "Shut up," Shenzhongan scolded. Shen Yu pursed her lips, holding the tea and giving Shen Zhao a wishful look. "Caogu, go and take inventory. I have something to say to the two brothers and sisters," Shenzhongan said to the deputy general. The deputy general knew that the rest was just a family matter and he couldn't get involved, so he accepted the order and lifted the curtain and left. As soon as Fang went out, there were soldiers outside the tent saying that the water had been boiled and had been placed in Shen Zhao's tent. Shen Yu hadn't taken a proper bath since she entered the camp, so she could only secretly wipe it while everyone was sleeping. Now that she had returned from a bloody bath, the blood on her body was so dry that it made her feel uncomfortable. She looked at Shenzhongan eagerly, waiting for him to speak. Shenzhongan turned away his face and waved his hands and said, "Zhao, take your sister to your tent. After washing, come over and I have something to say." After leaving the tent, Shen Yu went around to Shen Zhao's tent, squatted under the tent and dug for a long time. She took out a bag and patted it. Fortunately it's still there. Shen Zhao smiled and shook his head helplessly. She has not changed her habit. She likes to hide things like a little mouse. She hid food when she was a child, but now she doesn't know what she is hiding. Shen Yu lifted the baggage and said, "My clothes and banknotes are all in it." Shen Zhao accompanied her to the door of the tent and said, "You go in and wash your feet. I'll guard them for you. Soak your feet in warm water before washing them." After walking for such a long distance, both of them were covered with a layer of snow on their heads and shoulders. Shen Zhao stood in front of the tent, and the soldier found an umbrella for him to hold. The conditions in the military camp were not as good as at home, so it would be nice if she could be washed. The soldier still found a small wooden bucket for her, which she could barely squeeze into if she was squeezed. Shen Yu couldn't help but let out a sigh of satisfaction as her cold feet soaked in the water. After washing for almost half an hour, the water was almost cold before Shen Yu got up. After finishing, she felt refreshed all over. All the black spots on his face were washed away, and his small, porcelain white face was tucked into a large cloak. His hair had not yet been dried, and his semi-wet hair was tied on top of his head. Shen Zhao glanced at her several times and finally liked her appearance. "She's lost weight." "Can I not lose weight?" she complained as she walked. "You didn't take me with you. I walked in a hurry and there was no way to guide me. I couldn't get into the city along the way. I slept on trees and in ruined temples. I gnawed on them. A lot of solid food." Shen Zhao held an umbrella, and the two of them went to the main tent side by side. The sand table in the tent was already surrounded by people, and several lieutenants had their eyes red from the heat. After Shenzhongan gave the instructions, he let everyone disperse. De Ma Jin Dao sat down and said, "Auntie, please tell me in detail what happened in the Zihuabei camp." Shen Yu told what happened. "I saw that the wind was blowing from the north, so I lit a fire on the south side of the grain depot. The wind led the fire to the camp. Although the fire looked big, it actually didn't burn much grain and grass. I brought back everything I could bring with me. If I couldn't bring it with me, I just had a fire." Clicked. Kongqing cut off their horse path in the rear, and they couldn't catch up. The grain truck was too heavy, and the road was difficult to travel in the wind and snow, so they came back a little late. Shenzhongan patted her on the shoulder like he would his son, which was a silent approval. Shenzhongan couldn't help but think again, why isn't he a boy? If the boy followed him to fight on the battlefield, he wouldn't feel so distressed. Caogu just checked the grain and grass. In addition, the grain and grass you brought back can only last for 2 days at most. When will the grain and grass from Chengdu be shipped? I'm afraid it will take another 4 or 5 days, Shen Yu said. Shenzhongan was silent. Shenzayadao, there is a detailed operation in the army. Several generals in the army know about last night's raid, and we are still unable to tell who it is. I am afraid that the Zihu people know that we are short of food and will launch a general attack only after 3 days when we run out of food. Shenzhongan nodded. I sent 3 military letters to report the news of food and fodder, but Shengjing has not responded yet. It's no longer possible to wait like this. I have just discussed it with the generals and will break camp early tomorrow morning and retreat to Yanliang Pass. We need to get through these few days of food shortage. Shen Yu went out of the tent first, and when Shen Zhao came back, she was nowhere to be seen. Where is she? Shen Zhao lifted the curtain and came out. The soldier replied, she said she was going back to rest first, and told the general that if anything happened, he would send someone to call her in the tent. Shen Zhao walked for a while before he found Shen Yu's tent. As soon as he reached the door, a strong man lifted the curtain and came out. When he saw Shen Zhao, he immediately saluted, "General." Shen Zhao nodded and opened his mouth. He didn't know Shen Yu's alias in the army and didn't know how to ask. I had to say, "Where is she?" Yang Bang asked, "Who is it?" "A new recruit to your account." Oh, Yang Bang suddenly realized, "You said Shen Bao Er, he just went into sleep." Shen Zhao's eyebrows twitched. "Well done, Shan Power." He went directly into the tent and saw the people nestled at the foot of the bunk. His eyebrows couldn't stop jumping again. "Shan Power," Shen Zhao shouted through gritted teeth. The people in the corner of Tongpu remained silent. Several people in the tent didn't dare to breathe. Only Udasy answered, "He just came back in the morning. He said he went to help other teams and just went to bed." Shen Zhao suddenly turned around and looked, startled by the big mouth, and stepped forward to pull Shen Yu up from the bunk. "Shen Bao Er, come with me." Shen Yu followed in a daze, listening to Shen Zhao's constant scolding. "You are a girl after all," he lowered his voice. "What would it be like to hang out in a big shop with a group of men?" Shen Yu half opened her eyes. "I sleep in the corner, and I cover myself with my own quilt. I follow the authority when things are urgent. I am almost a man now." Shen Zhao took a handful of her head and took her back to his tent. He pulled a curtain in the tent to separate her. "You can rest here from today on." Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 16. The snow outside the customs was extremely heavy, and it also snowed heavily in Shengjing, thousands of miles away. Zhang Lianzi left the household department and the carriage drove along Zongbao Street. The road was slippery in the snow and there were so many people on the street that the carriage could not run. It stopped completely while walking. Attendant Gao Jin lifted the curtain and said, "Sir, I'm afraid we're going to be stuck for a while. The Sanwei Tower happens to be right next to it. Do you want to go up and have a rest first?" Zhang Lianzi looked around and saw that someone's horse was lying in the middle of the road. It was numb from the cold and refused to move no matter how hard the whip was whipped. The road was blocked by vehicles. Zhang Lianzi simply got out of the car, and when he stepped into the Sanwei building, he happened to see the waiter serving food to a table. There was a small plate of pineapple cake on the tray. Zhang Lianzi paused for a moment, then went upstairs and took a seat under the guidance of the waiter. "Is the pineapple cake just now still fresh?" The waiter smiled and said, "What a coincidence, sir. They are all freshly cooked. Can I give you a portion?" Zhang Lianzi said, "Pack it carefully in a food box. If you have sweet-scented Osman, thus sugar steamed chestnut flour cake, pine nut and lily cake, etc., also put some in it and send them over." The waiter nodded hurriedly and agreed, and soon he brought an exquisite wooden food box. Zhang Lianzi opened the lid and looked at the snacks in the food box silently. In the past, Shen Yu took medicine all year round and liked sweets the most. There were always some of her favorite snacks at home. Zhang Lianzi pinched a piece from the food box and tasted it. He found it was too sweet and cloying. He didn't like sweets. It was probably because Au had suffered too much that she wanted such sweetness. You are quick on your feet. Send the food box to the general's mansion. Gao Jin knew who he was giving it to and felt unhappy, but he still slipped on the road. They sent food and clothing to the general's residence every 2 days, but Miss Shen didn't come out to see her. Every time, it was Miss Shen who came to deliver the message, and her airs were quite high. When Gao Jin came back after delivering the things, the road was open. Zhang Lian got on the carriage and asked, "The second lady came out to pick her up today? Did you say she is feeling better?" "Yes," Gao Jin said, "the second young lady said that the eldest lady's illness is much better, but she just doesn't like to go out. But today the second lady brought a message to the eldest lady." Zhang Lianzi raised his eyes, "What are you talking about?" Gao Jin said, "Don't send me any more gifts if you tell me it's something. I want to ask you something. Is there any news about Yanliang Pass?" Zhang Lianzi frowned. "Tomorrow is October 27th, Shenzhongan will be defeated on this day, and Shen Yu will go to collect the bones of her father and brother in a few days, and what happened to her happened on the way. He had to stop her this time, at least to let her have a healthy body, because he still wanted to stay with her for many years. The wind and snow outside the pass were raging, and several tents were crushed last night. Fortunately, the people below were okay. When we got up in the morning, the army had already begun to break up camp and retreat into the pass." Shen Yu darkened her face and eyebrows again and followed Shen Zhao. Then he saw a soldier running over in a hurry. "General, Mr. Liang, the supervisor, is missing." Shen Zhao looked solemn. "What's going on?" The soldier said, "The guard at the camp gate said that as soon as he saw Lord Liang, he took his own troops to the direction of Yanliang Pass." Shen Zhao waved his hand, "Go after him and see if you can catch him back. If you can't catch him back, that's all." Supervising the army is equivalent to Shen Jing's recruitment in the army. Liang Jianfang has done nothing since he entered the camp. He spends all day in the tent and has people serve him good wine and food. The army has been short of food these days, and he has already complained. It has happened several times that such a person who is greedy for life and afraid of death will be a useless person if he stays in the army. This place is more than 100 miles away from Yanliang Pass, and we can march up to 50 miles in a day in the snow. The remaining rations can only last until Yanliang Pass. The follow-up supplies are not yet available. I am afraid that I will be hungry for several days before I can survive this battle." On the evening of the second day, the snow finally stopped. Across the Pingchuan River outside Yanliang Pass, you can see the brown city wall standing in the snow in the distance. Shen Yu breathed a sigh of relief. The army could finally enter the pass before sunset. The three armies would rest tonight and everyone could have a good sleep. However, the days of starvation were still to come. Two scouts who were scouting the road galloped towards them from the direction of Yanliang Pass. He turned over and dismounted, knelt on one knee and said, "General, the gate of Yanliang Pass is closed. I have shown my token, but the city guard refuses to open the door." Shenzhongan tightened his grip on the reins, raised his chin at Shenzhao, and the two led a group of soldiers forward. Shen Yu felt very uneasy. Although he had successfully avoided the deadly battle in his previous life, there was no reason for the constant panic in his heart. After marching another 2 miles, a message was sent from the front to camp where they were, which was less than 5 miles away from the city gate. There were only 5 miles left, but without entering the city, everyone in the army began to speculate. Shen Yu rode up to catch up, and when she got closer, she heard Shenzhongan cursing. "Tell Liang Jianfang to open the door." Liang Jianfang stood on the tower and said loudly, "General Shen, it's not that I won't open the door, it's just that before sending out troops, His Majesty ordered that this battle must be won. Now that the two sides are at loggerheads, there is no reason for our army to retreat." Shen Zhong'an was furious, and before he could say anything, the deputy general next to him had already cursed, "I can't keep up with the follow-up baggage. I'm fighting on the front line, but you wimps who can't even lift a knife are hiding in the city and enjoying the hot food of. You are humming trying to force us to death. Now there is no food and grass. If the Zihu attacks at this time, there will be no way out. If our front line is broken, you idiot thinks you can escape by hiding in the city." Bold, Liang Jianfang stood on the tower and yelled, "As a supervisor, if you are here to confuse people with your lies, I will take you down immediately. You humming come down and get me." Deputy General Cao Gu yelled, "If you don't come out, you will be the grandson." There was constant cursing at the city gate, but the gate remained motionless. It was getting dark, and bonfires were lit in the camp. Shen Zhong'an stood on a small earthen bag and could see the faint light of the torch on the Yan Liangwan gate in the distance. On the first day, the army ran out of food and the city gate was not opened. On the second day, the soldiers in the army looked haggard due to hunger. Everyone was recuperating and could only reduce their activities as much as possible to conserve their energy. On the third day, the city gate was still not open. Shen Zhao opened the curtain and went out of the tent, and found Shen Yu sitting on the earthen bun. "What is Liang Jianfang's plan?" Shen Yu asked after he sat down. Shen Zhao picked out the snow and pulled out a withered grass. "We are trying to force our idea to death. Several forces in the capital are fighting. We are likely to become consumables in their internal fighting, or Liang Jianfang will become Zihu's mole." Just when Shen Yu was about to ask again, Shen Zhao let out a shush, took out a paper bag from his lapel, spread it out, and handed it to her like a treasure. "Are you hungry?" Shen Yu stared blankly at the corn bun, and Shen Zhao passed it forward again. "Eat it." Shen Yu took it and broke it in half, but Shen Zhao didn't take it. "If you don't eat, I won't eat either," she said. Shen Zhao raised his lips and smiled, picked up the corn bun and took a bite. Then Shen Yu started eating. "It doesn't taste good, it's cold, hard, and even a little dry. You can still feel the rough texture scraping across your throat when you swallow it." The two of them finished eating the steamed buns in the dark night and cold wind. "Tomorrow I will send a small team of people to you and ask Kongqing to follow you. You go all the way to the north, to the fiefdom of Balanqing, and then take a detour back to Beijing." Shen Yu remained silent, and she could tell that this was tantamount to explaining the funeral arrangements. No, she obviously tried so hard, why couldn't she prevent the tragedy from happening? After 2 days, they all discovered a fact that they had to admit. If they lose this battle, it will not be a natural disaster, but a man-made disaster. As early as they set out from Shengjing, this will be a dead end. Some people want them dead and defeated. But she was only a mortal after all. She could find a way to avoid that deadly battle, but she couldn't stop the hands that stabbed them behind her, because you couldn't tell where those people would stab her next. Shen Yu turned her face away. "I won't leave." "Listen to brother," Shen Zhao advised. Shen Yu said resolutely, "We will attack the city tomorrow. The garrison in the city is less than 10,000. Taking Yanliang Pass will not be a problem." Shen Zhao smiled bitterly. "Are you raising a knife to one of your own? Those are not our own at all. They want us dead." "But the people are not like that," Shen Zhao said with an indescribably cool look. "Once we attack the city, we will become rebels. Then we will lead the army to retreat." Shen Yu couldn't think about that much now, and just said whatever was in her mind. Shen Zhao said, "You also said that the garrison in the city is less than 10,000. We can bypass the Zihu people and go straight to Yanliang Pass. What will happen to the hundreds of thousands of people in the pass?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the Concubine, Eliminating the Wife, Reborn, I Refuse to Marry the Scumbag and Marry the Prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 17. The snow behind them made a crunching sound. They both turned around at the same time and saw Shenzhongan walking in the deep snow, one foot shallow and the other foot. What are you two doing here? We're sharing the buns to eat, Shen Yu said. Shenzhongan smiled knowingly, took out a steamed bun from his chest and handed it to her. Food was in short supply, and one general only had a bowl of porridge and a steamed bun. Both her father and brother wanted to leave the good ones to her. Shen Yu finally couldn't hold it in any longer and said with red eyes, I just finished eating and I can't eat any more. The army has run out of food, so it would be nice to have something to eat, but not enough to eat. Shenzhongan kicked Shen Zhao, and Shen Zhao stepped aside. He sat down between the two of them, stuffed the steamed buns into Shen Yu's hands and said, Eat, kill the horse tomorrow, and let all the soldiers have a full meal, so that they can cheer up, fight again. Killing the horse is already the final decision with no way out. That is the last meal of millions of sons and daughters. No one spoke, and the cold wind howled over the hills and blew farther away. Shenzhongan put his arms around the two children and looked into the distance and said, Beyond the Blackbird Mountain is the land within the pass. The great Zhou dynasty has stood here for hundreds of years. The land under our feet has buried the lives of many heroes. Dry bones. I have thought about it before. What would your mother do if one day I was wrapped in horse leather and buried in a foreign land? Then she died so early, and she asked me to bury her on the flattest land in Hike Mountain. She said, what if one day, I can meet her by walking down the river? Shen Yu's eyes were sore. In her previous life, she had never come to the border, nor had she heard such farewell words from her father. She rushed thousands of miles from Shengjing, buried the broken bones of her father and brother, and buried them in the ancestral grave of the Shen family. She is not afraid of death, she just hates it. A hero should die on the battlefield with dignity, instead of being trapped here in a cowardly manner by being attacked from both sides. Shenzhongan looked calm, patted them both on the shoulders, stood up and walked back. Shen Yu, Dad. Shenzhongan knew what she was going to say, raised his hand and waved it, and his heavy voice was carried by the wind. We should die in admonishment, and we should die in battle. This should be the fate of a soldier. The winter outside Guan is so cold. Shenzhongan looked up at the sky, he couldn't leave. As soon as they leave, the Zihu people can take Yanliang Pass directly. There are hundreds of thousands of people in the pass, and they need to be blocked by a wall made of their corpses. Therefore, we may lose this battle, but we must not retreat. But his daughter was not a soldier, and she still had a long way to go. He could not let her young body be buried here, trampled into pulp by the western horses. The two watched Shenzhongan leave, and Shen Zhao took off the bag from his waist and handed it to her. Shen Yu took it, smelled it, and smiled, it's a burning knife. Drink a little to warm yourself up, don't drink too much, Shen Zhao warned. Shen Yu took a sip, and the strong alcohol burned her throat, and her whole body became warmer. She handed it back to him. Shen Zhao shook his head, looked in the direction of the camp and said, send a message to her for me. Who? Shen Yu turned her head. Shen Zhao looked in the direction of Shengjing with gentle eyes, tell her not to wait for me. Shen Yu understood who she was referring to, and her eyes turned red instantly, I can't pass this on. You can go back and tell her yourself. Shen Zhao smiled, forget it, don't say anything to her. It's best just like this. She will forget it as time goes by. Shen Yu shook her head, how could she forget? How could someone who had been engraved in their bones forget easily? Miss Yu had never married until her death. She turned her head and looked at Shen Zhao's face, her eyes gradually becoming difficult to focus. She shook her head, her vision became more blurred. You were in the wine. Shen Zhao didn't wait for her to finish her words, he pushed her head on his shoulder. Auntie, don't take revenge for this. Just move forward and live your own life. My brother and parents are watching. And you. After he finished speaking, he looked down at her. The girl had fallen asleep on his shoulder. He carried her on his back and walked silently towards the south of the camp, just like the path he had taken with her on his back. Cha-cha, cha-cha. Ayu, you will have to walk alone in the future. 3 miles south of the camp, a small group of soldiers lined up here. Shen Hongan took the lead. When Shen Zhao approached, he got off his horse and picked up the sleeping Shen Yu. The heavy snow had stopped a long time ago, and the snow reflected the moonlight and gave off a bright white light. They said goodbye silently, no one spoke, except for the sound of footsteps and the scraping of armor, and the only sound left was the horses panting. After settling down Shen Yu, the two got on their horses. Shen Zhao whipped his horse, pointed in one direction and said to Kong Qing, if you keep walking in this direction, you can go to the fiefdom of King Balin. Kong Qing knelt on the ground. General. I handed her over to you, Shen Zhao said seriously, protect her. This is the last military order I give you. Kong Qing's face was stern, his eyes were scarlet. Yes. The last general takes the order. Let's go, Shen Hongan urged. He turned the horse's head and walked very slowly, hearing the sound of the hoofbeats of the small team behind him rustling away. He wanted to take another look at his daughter, but he couldn't bear to look back. That's all, whether you watch it or not, the ending is the same. There will always be a time to gather and part ways, and there will also be a time to see each other again. The sound of horse hooves rang in my ears, and my body gradually woke up from the jolts. Shen Yu slowly opened her eyes were completely dark, and her body was still semi-paralyzed. She tried to move her arms, and the person in front of her seemed to notice that she had woken up, and lifted the cloak covering her head. Girl. She recognized Kong Qing's voice, and the dazzling light made her close her eyes instantly. Where am I? Kong Qing looked ahead. It's 100 miles north. We can cross the river in half a day's running, and then we can go around. Let me down, Shen Yu said. At this moment, she could see everything around her clearly. There were about 10 people in 2 queues, and she and Kong Qing were riding together. Probably because he was afraid that she would fall in a coma, Kong Qing tied her to his back. The horse was still heading north, but Kong Qing did not turn the horse's head. Shen Yu tried to struggle, but found that all the muscles and veins in her body were restrained. Realizing her intention, Kong Qing said, Girl, I am escorting you back to Shengjing under the order of the general. Shen Yu said sternly, I won't go back to Beijing. My father and brother are still outside Yanliang Pass. Do you want me to leave them and escape on my own? Kong Qing said nothing. Kong Qing, are you going to be a deserter? We are not deserters. If you are not a deserter, then follow me and fight back. Kong Qing suddenly reined in his horse, dismounted and stood to one side. Girl, we can't go back. Liang Jianfang has sealed the city. Food from within the pass cannot be transported out, and soldiers outside the pass cannot go back. This is a dead situation. So what if it's a dead end? Shen Yu said solemnly. Would you rather live in guilt for the rest of your life, or kill a few Zihu people and then die gloriously? Kong Qing was speechless, but the unwillingness on his face betrayed his thoughts. Shen Yu continued, if you die for your country on the battlefield, why should you return your body wrapped in horse leather? This is the first line of poetry my father taught me. If I don't retreat, even if I am buried there, I will watch others attack the Zihu people retreat. Kong Qing's eyes were about to burst, he raised his head and said, we will not retreat. Then untie the acupuncture points for me. Kongqing stared at her face, with a lot of struggle on his face. After a while, he shook his head and said, "As long as I am a soldier of the general, I will be ordered by him. After sending the girl back to Beijing, I will come to meet them get together." Shen Yu was furious. "Okay, you don't understand, right?" Kongqing looked at her in confusion. After a moment, he suddenly understood what she wanted to do. "No, girl." As soon as she finished speaking, the corners of Shen Yu's lips were already bleeding. "Can you understand?" she threatened. Mobilizing the inner energy to forcefully break through the acupuncture points is extremely harmful to the body. In serious cases, it may even cause the loss of martial arts. Kongqing felt as if an invisible knife was held to his neck, so he had to clean her acupuncture points neatly. In the next moment, Shen Yu grabbed the reins and turned the horse's head. "I have to go back. This is a road of no return. You can choose to leave on your own, or you can choose to fight back with me." The soldier held the reins tightly. "We will advance and retreat together with the girl." "Me too. At least kill a few Zihu people before we start." Kongqing took a deep breath, grabbed the reins and climbed onto the back of another horse. Out of the fortress Suzilin. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 18. The sound of killing at Yanliang Pass shook the sky. The sound of horse hooves, roars, and wails were mixed together in a broken manner that almost broke through the sky. Soldiers were everywhere, and there were corpses everywhere. The soldiers of the Zhou dynasty, who had been hungry for several days, used their remaining strength to draw their swords to resist the iron hoofs and butcher knives of the Zihu people. This is not a war, but an internal and external siege and massacre. Shen Yu led a team of troops from the edge and grabbed a long knife from the Zihu man's hand. She slashed the opponent with a horizontal sword. She heard Kongqing shouting from behind, "Girl, please be careful, let's go find the general." Shen Yu's eyes were red, and she had already shot out the blood mist. The long knife cut her open, so she threw it away and replaced it with another one. His arms were waving instinctively, and he had cut off the heads of countless Zihu people. "The enemy is strong and we are weak, the enemy is numerous and we are outnumbered, the soldiers of the Zhou dynasty are increasingly showing signs of decline, and they retreat to Yanliang Pass while fighting." Shen Yu kicked a Zihu soldier in the chest and used the force to get on the horse's back. She spun the knife in her hand and wiped off the neck of the Zihu soldier on the horse. This series of actions only happens in an instant. The back of the knife slapped the horse's butt, and the horse raised its front hooves high and rushed into the crowd. She crawled on the horse's back and harvested a head from time to time. She fought hard, but Dazhu was still retreating steadily. Less than a mile behind was the towering city wall of Yanliang Pass, but the city gate there was tightly closed, which was not their retreat at all. The closer we get to death, the more human fears begin to take over. Some soldiers rushed to Yanliang Pass, beating and banging on the heavy city gate like crazy, begging to be let in, but the gate failed to move at all. The Zihu people kept shrinking the front line. The remaining soldiers of the great Zhou dynasty were less than 20,000. They were trapped on this land. What greeted them was the final strangulation. The timid person couldn't help but start whimpering. The sound was blown by the cold wind, making it sound more and more desolate. Shen Yu shook off the blood beads on the long knife and took advantage of the gap to look around, but still did not see her father and brother. The Zihu people launched a general attack, and the swarms of Zihu people's brown iron armor pressed towards the city gate, seeming to be able to flatten the land in an instant. Everyone saw desperation in each other's eyes, as well as desperate determination. Kill him a few more Zihu people. We deserve to die, so be happy. Kill. Shen Yu felt that she could no longer wield the knife. She could no longer cut off the opponent's head directly with one strike. The man's neck was filled with blood and he fell down with his head tilted. She lost all her strength, and after cutting off one person's arm with a knife, the tip of the knife stood on the ground. She no longer knew how many knives she had broken, and she couldn't remember how many people she had killed. The tiger's mouth was torn out, and she tied the knife to her hand with a cloth strip. Now all I can think about is, where is my father? Where is my brother? It shouldn't be like this. Her rebirth is definitely not to relieve the pain of the past, absolutely not. But, who can come and help me? Just give me a hand, I just want them to live. She could no longer lift her strength and knelt down on one knee. The moment his knees hit the ground seemed to tremble instantly. Shen Yu supported the ground with one hand, and her palm sank into the blood mud. She could still feel the vibration under her hand, which became more and more obvious. Reinforcements. It's reinforcements. She raised her eyes and saw that the overwhelming black armor was rushing from the south, surging like a wave under the sky, and the snow waves rolled up were higher and higher. The sky and the earth were trembling, and the black armored troops rushed towards them, spreading their wings and surrounding the Zihu people. Someone suddenly shouted loudly, "It's the Qingyuan guards from Balin." Boom! The long-closed city gate finally made a dull sound. Countless black armored troops rushed out from the wide-open city gate, forming a three-sided siege. The situation suddenly reversed. Yes, it's not time to accept your fate yet. Shen Yu didn't know where she got the strength to stand up with the help of her knife. She slowly untied the cloth strips wrapped around her hands, and raised her knife when a Zihu man made a sneak attack. There was a blood mark on the Zihu man's face, and his tall body fell to the ground with a crash. Shen Yu dropped the knife, turned around and kicked with her toes, and the long knife flew out and instantly sank into the chest of a Zihu man. She picked up a knife and stabbed in again. The city gate towers into the clouds, with a crow-green war flag standing at the top and fluttering in the long wind, with a light blue cloud dotted above it. Xietingzhou looked down at the city, his eyes narrowed slightly by the wind, and his features became even colder. The deputy general stood beside him without saying a word, but his expression was so serious that he could squeeze out water. It's so cruel. 100,000 troops were blocked outside the pass, hungry and became lambs to be slaughtered by the Zihu people. The Zihu people killed the soldiers of Dazhu as livestock, but those were the sergeants who followed Shenzhongan up the Daoshan mountain. A deputy general Chang Hung stretched his neck while leaning on the female wall. He looked at it intently for a while and suddenly said, "Hey, good boy, there is such a person in Shenzhongan's army. This knife is very good." Xietingzhou followed his gaze and saw that this place occupies a high ground and the movements of the battlefield were clear at a glance. He saw the man without much effort. It was true that that man among the thousands of soldiers was too eye-catching. He drew his sword and saw blood. He killed one person in 3 steps. Wherever he went, corpses of the Zihu people were lying at their feet. He was like a sharp blade, avoiding the enemy troops with great force. The man stood in the middle of the chaos, holding a sword in his left and right hands. The enemy's long sword slashed at him. He blocked it with his left hand, and with a backhand strike with his right hand, he instantly cut off a man's neck. The donated blood spurted out, and the man was covered in blood, as if he had been dipped in a pool of blood in hell. The long knife became curled when cutting, so he replaced it with another one, but never stopped. Xietingzhou also had people who were good at martial arts, but they were not as desperate as this one. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 19. The Zihu army retreated steadily under the Qingyuan Guards' offensive. Seeing that the situation was over, Boda gave the order and retreated outside the pass with the remaining soldiers. Chang Hung cupped his fists and said, "Your Highness, do you want to take advantage of the victory and pursue it?" Xie Tingzhou looked at the retreating direction of the Zihu people and said calmly, "Order Ji Wu to pursue them for 30 miles and force them across the Shima River first." Chang Hung took the order and went down the city wall. Soon, footsteps sounded again on the city wall. Xie Tingzhou turned his head slightly and saw guard Zifeng pressing the sword on his waist with one hand and climbing onto the city wall aggressively. "Your Highness." Zifeng knelt on one knee. Xie Tingzhou lowered his head, rolled up his sleeves, and asked, "Where is Liang Jianfang?" 11 Feng said, "When the Zihu people attacked him, he ran away with his men first. He just chased them back and locked them in a prison car." "Bring it up." Liang Jianfang was brought to the city wall, along with his 2 guards. There was a strong wind on the city wall, and Liang Jianfang was pushed to the ground by Xie Tingzhou's guards. In front of him was the hem of the ink-colored robe, decorated with dark cloud patterns, swaying leisurely in the wind. Liang Jianfang's body was shaking like chaff, and he trembled and wanted to reach out to grab the hem of Xie Tingzhou's clothes. Before he even touched him, he was kicked by the guard next to him, causing him to fall down and hit his face on the ground until blood flowed. "His Royal Highness, I am an official of the Imperial Court." Liang Jianfang winced. "Court official?" Xie Tingzhou raised his arm slightly, pointed outside the city wall, and said, "Let him see for himself." The guards dragged Liang Jianfang and pressed him against the crenellations of the female wall, with half of his body hanging outside the city wall. The battle lines had long since moved away, leaving behind a land soaked in blood. The blood gathered into streams and drew lines on the snow. Thousands of corpses were piled on top of each other in confusion, stretching into the distance. It's so tragic. If you see such a scene when you wake up from a dream, you will wonder if you have arrived in the Abi hell. But this is reality. It is the hell on earth created by Liang Jianfang behind closed doors. The dead body underneath opened its eyes and looked at him, as if it wanted to ask for his life. Liang Jianfang roared in fear from his throat. He shook his head and didn't want to look anymore, but the guard grabbed his hair tightly from behind. Xie Tingzhou slowly raised his hand, and his long and flawless fingers were exposed from the cuffs. Bah! The sound of a long sword being unsheathed. Xie Tingzhou pressed the edge of his sword against Liang Jianfang's chin, forcing him to look into the distance. He whispered, "Don't lower your head, look carefully. This hell on earth is all the work of you, the imperial official." Liang Jianfang cried and begged, it's not me, Your Majesty, please spare your life, Your Majesty." Xie Tingzhou chuckled lightly and turned his eyes from Liang Jianfang's bodyguard who was kneeling aside. The look in his eyes was so sharp that the guard was sweating. Your Majesty, we are just following orders. I have a family at home, The guard's eyes widened suddenly, and his sight reflected his kneeling body. His head rolled several times on the city wall, and finally stopped. In addition to the smell of blood, the wind also carried a faint smell of urine. As soon as the guard let go, Liang Jian easily turned into a puddle of mud. Xie Tingzhou glanced at Liang Jianfang in disgust. "Guess, do I dare to kill you on the spot?" He threw the sword to Zifeng, and the guard beside him handed over a clean handkerchief. "Your Highness." Xie Tingzhou took it, wiped his fingers with his eyes and said, "Watch him, there are many people in Shenjing who want his life." Shen Yu rummaged through the mountain of corpses and the sea of blood, rummaging through the corpses one by one. Every moment was torturous, for fear that she would see the face of her father or brother in the next moment. She saw people she had seen in the corpse, including the boy who delivered meals, the soldiers on night watch, and the soldiers who had raided the Zihuobei camp with her. Some people had their hands and feet cut off, some were disemboweled, and some were trampled beyond recognition by iron hooves. The cold wind was still howling outside Yanliang Pass. She gritted her teeth and held back tears. Her fingernails were already torn and turned over, but she still didn't stop searching. Finally, after she turned over a corpse full of arrows, she could no longer suppress the sobs in her throat. "Father!" She hugged the corpse tightly, but the corpse's back was full of arrows, not even an inch of where to start. Her father, the towering mountain in her heart, collapsed again, this time in front of her. "Ah!" Shen Yu hugged Shenzhongen's body tightly. The body was cold and her heart was also cold. She really wanted to hug her father's broad shoulders, but his back was full of arrows and turned into a human-shaped hedgehog. There was no blood left on the corpse, and when the arrows were pulled out, only bloody holes were left. The last arrow was pulled out, and Shen Yu hugged Shenzhongen's body with all her strength. Those past grievances and unwillingness suddenly swarmed in, rolling over her and drowning her. These people risk their lives, but some people treat them like ants. They charged into battle and went through life and death, but in the end they didn't even have a full meal, so they were sent to the execution ground of the Zihu people by their own people. With the annihilation of traitors and the murder of loyal people, the internal affairs of the Zhou dynasty were already rotten. The unavenged revenge, anger, hatred, and unwillingness turned into endless threads that bound her tightly, and only the sobs spread into the wind. Soldiers were cleaning the battlefield and taking the wounded back for treatment. People were coming and going at the Ganzhou campus. From time to time, injured people were carried in, and some who could not hold on until they died were carried out. Xietingzhou stood in front of the camp, listening to the generals beside him reporting on the battle situation. "We pursued for 30 miles according to His Highness's order. Thousands of Zihu people were killed and wounded along the way. Crossing the Shima River is the land of Zihu. We guarded the riverside for several hours to make sure that the Zihu people would not turn back and then let the army go. Withdrew." General Ji Wu had just returned from the battlefield. He hadn't even had time to take off his armor. He was riding his horse back all the way, still smelling fishy. Ji Wu didn't dare to get too close to Xietingzhou. The prince is a bit misophobic, which is a fact known to everyone in the army. Ganzhou's garrison is useless. In the past, Shenzhongen relied on Shenzhongen to guard the banks of the Shima River. Now Shenzhongen has almost wiped out his entire army. If our Qingyuan guards withdraw, Ganzhou will probably. Xietingzhou looked at the soldiers coming and going and said, 11 Zhu's vitality is severely damaged, and it may be difficult to regain its strength within 2 years. We have bought Shengjing 2 years, which is enough for them to rebuild their defense line. Thinking of the brutality of this battle, Ji Wu couldn't help but curse, those bitches who kill 1,000 swords don't regard the soldiers as human beings at all. Xietingzhou didn't answer, and more injured people were brought in one after another. "Hey, wait a minute." The speaker with an extremely loud voice was Xietingzhou's Deputy General Chang Hung. Chang Hung stopped 2 soldiers carrying a stretcher, bent down to look at the person on the stretcher, and then sniffed with his fingers. "I have to die. What's going on? Is this person seriously injured?" The author has something to say. In this story, rebirth does not mean invincibility, which is not a cool story. AU needs to grow up in hardships again and again. The story I want to tell is not just about saving her father and brother. AU's mission is far more important than this. She will meet the person who is with her along the way. The companions thanked Tingzhou. "I guess many friends will say that since I didn't save my father, what's the point of being reborn? Because AU's mission is far more important than this. The previous plot must be connected with the following plot, and there must be a reason for arranging General Shen's death. The plot cannot satisfy the preferences of all readers. If you like it, that is our fate. If you don't like it, support abandoning the article. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 20. The soldier carrying the stretcher replied, "Back to General, the injury is not serious. It seems to be from the cold." While talking, Xietingzhou and Han Jiwu had already walked over. "Your Highness." Chang Hung saluted with clasped fists. Xietingzhou nodded briefly, looked at the person on the stretcher and asked, "Do you know him?" The person on the stretcher was covered in blood, his face could not be seen at all, and even his eyelashes were stuck together. Chang Hung said, "Not even acquaintance, this person is the guy who killed very fiercely on the female wall that I saw before. His kung fu is very good." Han Jiwu rarely heard Chang Hung praise others, so he became interested. He carefully looked at Shen Yu on the stretcher, shook his head and said, "Too thin, his physique doesn't look good." "You didn't see the scene at that time," Chang Hung said excitedly, "this man still used two swords." He put his hand on the side of Shen Yu's neck and asked, "Why is it so cold?" The soldier replied, "This man seems to have been looking for someone on the battlefield all night. This morning when we went to take inventory of the battlefield, we saw him hugging a corpse and not letting go. He almost froze with the corpse. It took some effort to remove the person." "Pull away." Chang Hung shook his head when he heard it. It sounded miserable enough. "I guess they are good brothers, but they are very affectionate and righteous." "It's General Shen's body," the soldier said solemnly. Chang Hung and Ji Wu looked at Xietingzhou at the same time, and Ji Wu asked, "Where is General Shen's body?" The soldier said something to the person next to him, and within a moment, another stretcher came over. The difference was that this time it was covered with a layer of white cloth. Chang Hung was about to reach out to lift it, but Xietingzhou stopped him and immediately scratched his head in embarrassment. "I don't mean to disrespect General Shen, I just want to confirm." Xietingzhou's expression was cold and solemn. "Help General Shen clean up the tent and come out. This is the pillar of the country, and he should be treated as a loyal man. Even if he dies, he cannot be watched by others at will." The early morning atmosphere was suppressed by the wind, and no one looked any better. Chang Hung called to the soldiers, "Take him in and treat him well. I have taken a liking to this boy. When he is well, he will be taken into my camp." The soldiers responded quickly, carrying the stretcher and preparing to send the person for treatment. The next moment, everyone stood there in shock. "I saw the bloody hand on the stretcher hanging on Xietingzhou's cuff. The prince always likes to be clean, how can he bear this?" Chang Hung cherished his talent and was afraid that Xietingzhou would chop off the hand with his sword, so he quickly stretched out his hand to pull it, while persuading, "Your Highness, this is a good young man who is practicing martial arts. It would be a pity to chop it off." "Xietingzhou." Chang Hung held Shen Yu's hand. It was strange. She had already fainted, but she was still so strong. She grabbed her sleeve and refused to let go. "What are you doing standing still?" Chang Hung said, "Hurry up and pull him away." The soldiers quickly stepped forward to help. One of them took Shen Yu's hand and stretched out his fingers one by one. "Tisk, if you break such thin fingers carefully, how can you hold a knife in the future? Soldiers are not human beings inside and out, neither are they separated by force, nor are they separated by force." The person on the stretcher suddenly moved, but he grabbed his sleeves tighter, moved his chapped lips, and spit out an inaudible sound. "Father!" Everyone was stunned. Chang Hung opened his eyes wide. "Your Highness, this boy calls you daddy." Xietingzhou glanced at Chang Hung, "I can hear you." Chang Hung and Ji Wu did not dare to laugh. The eldest son has not yet married a wife, and he has become a father ahead of schedule. He is still such a big boy. This boy is really good at choosing. He will choose the eldest son of his family at the first opportunity. Xieting Zhou lowered his eyes and saw that the hand gripping his sleeve was so hard that a circle of green and white formed on his fingertips. The man was lying on a stretcher, his head tilted to one side weakly, and his neck was so thin that it could be broken with just a little force of one hand. "Don't go," Shen Yu murmured again. Xieting Zhou frowned, with a hint of impatience between his brows. Chang Hong saw something was wrong and said, "Dion." There was a snap, and the cuffs broke into two pieces. Xieting Zhou returned the sword to its sheath and raised his eyelids slightly. "What's the matter?" "No, it's nothing." Chang Hong touched his chest with lingering fear and said cheerfully, thinking that it was fortunate that the hand was not chopped off. Xieting Zhou fluttered his sleeves and left. Chang Hong bumped into Ji Wu's shoulder and asked in a low voice, "Is this the legendary broken sleeve?" Ji Wu glared at him. "If you don't want to die, you can say that." Shen Yu was so burned that she became delirious. In the dream, sometimes it was about the past life, and sometimes it was about my father who was shot into a hedgehog corpse. Where is my brother? Where is Shen Zhao? Where is Kong Cheng? Did he find him? The wind in Yanliangwen didn't seem so cold anymore, but the sky was very dark, like dark red blood sinking from the sky. Shen Yushan walked one foot in front of the other in the snow. Every time she took a step, she felt a force pulling her down. She looked down and saw that the ground was covered in blood, and there were countless hands struggling in the blood. She seemed unable to walk. Suddenly a familiar voice came from the distant wind. "Don't look down, look forward." "Dad," Shen Yu shouted, staggering forward in the direction of the voice. The figure in the distance is getting closer and closer. On the high city wall, Shen Hongan stands in the wind. He stretched out his hand towards her. "Come up and take a look, do you see anything?" Shen Yu raised her eyes and looked into the distance. "It's a sea of corpses." Shen Hongan shook his head. "Girl, you are looking in the wrong direction, turn around dash." Shen Yu turned around and looked towards the city. "Girl, you came back not to save me, but to save thousands of people in the pass. You see, history does not repeat itself. You changed the original trajectory and delayed time for us. Yanliang Pass was not broken, and Ganzhou City was not massacred. This is the meaning of your existence." Shen Yu shook her head desperately. "But I just want to save you and brother. I want you both to live." Shen Hongan smiled. "Your mother is waiting for me. She has waited too long. Then you wait for me, I'll come too." Shen Hongan shook his head and said, "You have more important things to do, Au, you can save more people, do you understand?" The figure gradually faded away, and Shen Yu moved forward desperately, but she couldn't catch a piece of clothing. "Father!" Shen Yu woke up tremblingly. Every breath felt like a knife cutting into her chest. Her eyelids were heavy. She didn't open them. She felt that there was someone else in the room. Something was brought to my lips, warm and with a strong medicinal smell. Shen Yu opened her eyes and looked, and the medicine boy who was giving the medicine was immediately startled. The medicine bowl fell to the ground with a clang. The medicine boy looked at Shen Yu on the bed and said in surprise, "You're awake." Shen Yu turned her head and saw that the medicine boy had stood up, and soon an elderly doctor came into the tent. As soon as the doctor entered the door, he took her hand and felt her pulse, and then ordered the medicine boy to bring in a new bowl of fried medicine. There were too many injured, and the military doctors were simply too busy. The doctors were all temporarily recruited from the city. This man received special care from General Chang, and his life had to be saved. He couldn't even take the medicine, but he didn't expect that he would wake up. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 22. To the north outside the city wall, the night sky was reddened by the light of the fire, and there was a faint smell of burning in the wind. Xieting Zhou was followed by a guard, followed by two generals wearing soft armor. Shen Yu had heard that Balin Crown Prince Xieting Zhou had two very powerful lieutenants, and they must be those two. Shen Yu was taken into the tent. The two lieutenants did not follow. There were only Xieting Zhou and one guard in the tent. "Raise your head," Xieting Zhou's voice was cold. Shen Yu slowly raised her head, and her eyes met Xieting Zhou's. Those eyes seemed to have substance, as if they could analyze people. But Shen Yu didn't hide, and looked back intently, because she knew that once she showed her cowardice, whatever she said next would be greatly discounted in Xieting Zhou's ears. Xieting Zhou looked at her. He is not tall, his frame and face are very small, his skin is a bit dark, but he has a pair of very beautiful eyes. The man took off his armor and looked much friendlier than he imagined. Thinking of this, Xieting Zhou couldn't help but be slightly startled. He would actually use the word weak to describe a soldier who could cut off the head of a Zihu person with one sword. If this is called weak, then there won't be many brave men in the army. He recovered his thoughts and asked, on October 25, Shenzhongan sent troops to sneak attack the Zihu North Camp, but the Zihu South Camp was unable to return reinforcements in time. Why didn't you take advantage of the victory and pursue it? Because it's snowing, the soldiers of the Zhou dynasty are not good at fighting in the snow, so they can only retreat to the camp first, Shen Yu said. Xieting Zhou sat down, rested his arms on the armrests, and continued to ask, "Did Shenzhongan find out that there are spies in the army?" "I discovered it," Shen Yu said, "so before sending troops on the 25th, we temporarily changed our plan. The original plan was to raid the Zihyanan camp. Are you among them? I followed the major general in a sneak attack on the north camp and burned their grain and grass. After wiping out the enemy, the major general rushed to the south camp to support the old general. I and 2,000 light cavalry were responsible for transporting some of the grain and grass back." Xieting Zhou nodded slowly, which was consistent with what he knew. Asking these questions is just a way to make sure that what this guy named Shiger said is somewhat true. "Who do you think is the traitor?" Shen Yu shook her head. "I'm not sure, or I'm not sure if there is only one traitor, Liang Jianfang." Xieting Zhou lowered his gaze slightly, falling on her hand hanging by her side, clenching her fists so tightly that the joints turned white. "Liang Jianfang has been taken into my custody. When the incident in Ganzhou happens, he will be taken to Beijing to await trial. Is there anything else you want to report?" Shen Yu lowered her eyes and stared at the ground. General Shen sent several urgent letters to Shengjing, but did not receive any reply. She couldn't tell too much because she wasn't sure whether the person in front of her was friend or foe. Xieting Zhou said, "The implications of this matter are too wide. Whether the urgent delivery reaches Shengjing is one thing. If it reaches the Ministry of War, who will suppress it is another matter." There was a black jade ring stuck on his slender finger, which made his skin look like jade. He turned the ring twice and slowly leaned over. The shadow under the light instantly enveloped Shen Yu. "You don't trust me?" He looked at her and said slowly, not as a question. "Yes, he's right. She really doesn't trust him now, or it can be said that she doesn't know who is trustworthy now." Xieting Zhou arrived too timely. To lead troops north from the northern border, even if it was a rapid march with light equipment, it would have to start 10 days in advance in order to arrive at the last moment. In the previous life, when Xieting Zhou arrived with Qingyun guards, it was already a few days after Zihu broke through the city of Ganzhou and was massacred. The question is, how could he predict the future this time? Could he be part of this? Xieting Zhou's eyes were like a falcon, and he had super insight. When confronting such a person, the most unwise behavior is to think that you are smart. "Your Highness," Shen Yu said calmly, "I have no allies, so I dare not trust anyone." Xieting Zhou leaned back, his lips curved slightly. Obviously I have more chips than you, and you have much less to lose than me. Shen Yu pursed her lips. Yes, what else can't be lost? She was almost beguiled by his words. Xieting Zhou was like a sloppy eagle, forcing his prey into a corner but not launching a fierce attack. Before anything happens in Ganzhou, you still have a lot of time to think about Shi and you. The name that came out of her mouth shook Shen Yu's heart. Just now she really felt that she had become the prey under his hands. He was not in a hurry to close the net, but watched her walk in willingly step by step. Go down. Xieting Zhou spoke before she could speak. Shen Yu stood up and walked out. When her eyes inadvertently glanced at a clothes hanger with an upturned head in the tent, her steps slowed down. There was a dark-colored robe hanging on the hanger. The hem of the robe was embroidered with dark cloud patterns, and this robe was missing a sleeve. She pinched her sleeves calmly. Was that piece of cloth originally Xieting Zhou's sleeve? But how did it get into her hands? Xieting Zhou raised his eyes and smiled. You want to ask why my clothes are missing a sleeve? But I would like to ask why you call me daddy. Did she call him daddy? When? Shen Yu looked at him in shock and happened to see the smile on Xieting Zhou's face. When he smiled, his whole person softened a lot. He was obviously such a sharp and cold person, but when he smiled, he was a bit dissolute and unruly. Shen Yu went out, and the smile on Xieting Zhou's face gradually faded. Send someone to follow him, he should have some inside information. 11 Feng took the order. Yes, Your Highness. There were 2 bonfires burning outside the tent, and several soldiers sat around eating baked potatoes. Seeing Shen Yu coming out, Chang Hong waved to her. Come here, come here. Shen Yu walked over and Chang Hong threw a hot potato to her. She quickly caught it, wrapped it in her sleeve and held it in her hand. Chang Hong looked her up and down. Where did you learn this skill? I learned it from the Major General, Shen Yu said. Come and sit here. Chang Hong took a bite of the potato, which was so hot that he grunted. I saved your kid's life. Report to me when you are better. The soldier next to him joked. General Chang started robbing people so early. What do you know? Chang Hong pushed the man. Do you understand that I am just pity? He turned his head and glanced at Shen Yu, then suddenly put his arm around her shoulders and patted her. Tisk, tisk, you're too thin. You need to take some supplements. Do you want me to roast some meat for you? Shen Yu froze and quietly moved half a step to the side. If General Chang can still eat the barbecue, he can eat it himself. I can't eat it. When she said this, everyone lost their appetite. There are too many corpses to deal with, otherwise it will be easy to cause diseases when the weather warms up after winter. Some of them were buried on the spot, and those that could not be buried were burned. Some soldiers and Zihu people were frozen together, so they had to be burned together. The fire burned for several days and did not go out. In the past few days, it was always floating in the wind. A smell of burnt meat.